On the dawn of June 22, 1941, the world witnessed a battle that shook the foundations of Western civilization. Adolf Hitler's insatiable war machine unleashed its fury upon a completely unprepared Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of a conflict that would leave Europe drenched in innocent blood. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, the German invasion came as a lethal blow that shattered their illusion of security. The might of the Red Army, until then considered invincible, crumbled before the relentless onslaught of blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war. Entire cities burned under the bombardment, while the countryside was stained scarlet by the sacrifice of brave Russian soldiers. However, beyond the thunder of weapons, there was an even darker and more disturbing truth. Things did not unfold as the Führer had planned. Historians consider the failure of this plan a turning point in World War II and the beginning of the end of German superiority. Why ultimately did Operation Barbarossa, despite its bloody successes, signify a crucial defeat for the Third Reich? We invite you to watch this video, where we delve into the paradox of the Nazi regime's most successful operation and its most devastating failure. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare your coat for the harsh Russian winter. The ambitions of the Führer in the East were not mere territorial cravings, but a grotesque expression of his worldview. Stalin represented to him the embodiment of absolute evil, communism, the inferiority of the Slavs, and the specter of Jewish influence. In his delusions of grandeur, victory over Russia was not just a military objective, but a crusade to spread terror and death throughout Europe. Influenced by the swift and successful blitzkrieg against France in 1940, Nazi leaders optimistically considered the possibility of applying a similar strategy in their invasion of the Soviet Union. They relied on the potential of their advanced tanks and perceived Stalin's supposed vulnerability as that of a vast yet fragile clay giant that would easily crumble under the German onslaught. This perception fueled the belief that the conquest of the East would be a relatively quick and straightforward endeavor. During the initial weeks of the war, the blitzkrieg advanced rapidly, managing to invade Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It was on June 22, 1941, when the offensive was unleashed along a front spanning 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, catching the Russian leadership by surprise and finding the Red Army in a partially static state. German forces moved forward, with armored divisions under generals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian achieving notable advances. Cities fell and vast areas were swiftly captured as the Nazis progressed toward their objectives. The resistance, although initially disorganized, proved resilient. Despite encirclements and overwhelming losses, Stalin's troops fought tenaciously, impeding the Nazi advance with fierce resistance and guerrilla tactics. In the south, German generals Gerd von Rundstedt and Ewald von managed to break through Soviet defenses and advance towards the Black Sea. Sieges at Kiev and Vyazma resulted in hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners. Nevertheless, pockets of resistance persisted, frustrating German attempts at total conquest.
К вам обращаемся, друзья мои. Вероломные военные нападения гитлеровской Германии на нашу родину начаты 22 июня.
Stalin, for his part, never believed in the materialization of Operation Barbarossa, and even in the initial stages of the conflict, when Soviet planes stationed were the target of enemy bombings, he sought to negotiate a solution. Despite constant warnings from Anglo-Saxon diplomacy, both British and American, the leader often smiled mockingly at the methods employed by his ally up to that point. However, this perception proved to be a serious error in judgment. Each previous alert had been different, and on this occasion, Hitler maintained a notable silence regarding his military movements, which was only broken half an hour before the roar of the cannons. Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of the USSR, was crucial in Operation Barbarossa, while other regions were left to fend for themselves. The British blockade drove Nazism to take control of these food resources. Russian production was destined for the conquerors, and primitive agricultural crops were established in the new administrative division, led by Alfred Rosenberg. Poland was converted into a protectorate called Ostland, while Ukraine was granted independence to unite it with the Reich. On June 22, 1941, exactly 1 year after the surrender of France, Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich, determined how German forces were divided for this operation. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was tasked with advancing towards Smolensk and then, according to the original plan, towards Moscow. However, they deviated north to assist Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, in its advance towards Leningrad. This division of forces was a controversial strategic decision and has been debated among historians. Some argue that the northern deviation was a tactical mistake that diluted the power of the advance towards Moscow, while others suggest it was a tactical necessity to secure the northern flank and supply lines in the campaign against Leningrad. In response, Georgy Zhukov, a prominent Soviet military leader, ordered the Red Army to attack and destroy the invader, but without crossing into Reich territory. Before that, the Russians requested Japan to act as an intermediary for a diplomatic solution, but when it became clear that there would be no such thing, it was announced that the USSR had been invaded and was at war. By that time, the Germans were already being ruthless and merciless with the Soviet population. Hitler told his commanders, "This is a war of extermination. If we do not understand this, we will defeat the enemy just the same, but 30 years later, we will have to fight the communists again. We do not wage war to preserve the enemy." The Einsatzgruppen, mobile units of the SS, unleashed a wave of terror in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Their main objective was to eliminate elements considered hostile to the Nazi regime, which included communists and Russian state officials. These shooting operations were primarily aimed at Jewish men, although other ethnic and political groups were also targeted. To carry out these atrocities, the Einsatzgruppen established ghettos and detention centers, where large numbers of prisoners were concentrated. They often collaborated with German army personnel, reflecting cooperation between different branches of the Nazi war machinery in the implementation of their genocidal policies. In Leningrad, the bloodiest and longest moment in history was established. In almost 900 days, hundreds of thousands of Russians died of starvation. That was the bet. Those who did not fall under Nazi bullets were to die from hunger. It seemed that all defenses in the east would be vulnerable. The Germans were fresh, there were millions of them. They had plenty of weapons. In late July 1941, leaders of the SS and police arrived in the Soviet Union, appointed by Himmler. With the support of local auxiliaries, they began to carry out mass executions of entire communities. This period witnessed an escalation in the systematic murder of innocent civilians as part of the Nazi strategy to eradicate those considered undesirable. On October 15, 1941, Hitler made the decision to deport German Jews to occupied Russia. The rapid advances on the military front and the horrendous crimes committed against the Soviets influenced this determination. This marked the beginning of what became known as the Final Solution, a policy that involved the physical annihilation not only of Jews in occupied territories, but of all those who inhabited Europe. This tragic chapter in European history led to the deaths of millions of innocent people in Nazi concentration camps. The letters sent by Nazi soldiers from the front to their families overflowed with messages of optimism and confidence. There was only room for victory. However, despite reaching the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941, the Germans found themselves halted by bitter cold and Russian counterattacks. As autumn progressed, Nazi momentum weakened, akin to leaves slowly falling from trees. The unforgiving Russian winter, which had once defeated Napoleon Bonaparte himself, began to menace the German army. Supply lines stretched thin, and the icy climate took its toll on ill-prepared troops. Zhukov's masterful leadership, coupled with reinforcements from Siberia, turned the tide against the invaders. The dream of capturing Moscow faded as Nazi casualties soared and the momentum of Operation Barbarossa stalled. In the south, Kleist's advance toward the Caucasus was halted, and Rundstedt's position in Rostov-na-Donu became untenable. The Soviet counterattack recaptured key territories, forcing the Germans to retreat and easing the pressure on Moscow. By the winter of 1941-1942, Operation Barbarossa had transformed from an ambitious conquest plan into a desperate struggle for survival. Logistics became a nightmare, exacerbated by Soviet scorched earth tactics that devastated the countryside and disrupted German movements. The Nazi army, ill-prepared to face the harsh Russian winter, found itself in the midst of an exhausting battle against nature and determined Soviet defenders. Despite initial advances, the invasion did not achieve its objectives, marking a crucial turning point on the Eastern Front and foreshadowing the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. The armament of both fronts was on such a gigantic scale that even today they are difficult to surpass. The Red Army had 24,000 tanks, but only a quarter of them were operational. Nazi intelligence severely underestimated this number, estimating that the Red Army had around 10,000 tanks in total. Additionally, the Soviets had developed two new models, the T-34 and the KV-1. These tanks were unknown to the Germans, who were unaware of their capabilities on the battlefield. As for the Air Force, the Red Air Force had a numerical advantage with around 8,000 aircraft, but many of them were in poor condition. The purges in the Red Army, which had eliminated many experienced officers, left command in the hands of men with limited military competence. Despite some changes after the Winter War, there wasn't enough time for thorough training. On the other hand, Benito Mussolini's blunders caused a delay of up to 5 weeks in Operation Barbarossa. The Italian fascist leader had decided to undertake a military campaign in Greece without the consent or proper coordination with his German ally, Adolf Hitler. This action diverted resources and delayed the execution of Operation Barbarossa. Many of those accused in the Nuremberg trials pointed to this fact as decisive for the failure, along with the ill-conceived plan to capture Moscow just before the arrival of winter. The Nazi forces were left at the outskirts of the Russian capital, waiting in a peripheral bus station. However, if deadlines had been met, the offensive would have taken place during the rainy spring of 1942 in Central Europe, with terrain unsuitable for a successful blitzkrieg. The course of events could have been very different. The fall of Moscow, the jewel of the Soviet crown, would have been a monumental feat, a blow that would have resonated in the annals of history and perhaps determined the end of World War II in Hitler's favor. Ultimately, today's new world order would have been different if Operation Barbarossa had had a different outcome. Another crucial aspect of Operation Barbarossa and the beginning of the campaign to the east was its role as a turning point in the Holocaust. From then on, the persecution and murder of Jews were carried out systematically and without disguise. The Nazis did not miss any opportunity to commit atrocities, extending their cruelty to the territories they left behind as they advanced in their military invasion. Despite the adversities on the Russian front, they continued with the extermination relentlessly.
The offensive was over, but looking at the whole picture as Barbarossa came to a halt, Germany still seemed to be in a good position. Army Group North was sure that the besieged Leningrad was about to fall. Army Group Center were at the gates of Moscow, and Army Group South had taken the Ukraine and Kiev. When the new year came, they planned to finish the job. However, little did they know, the Soviets had an ace up their sleeve.
Despite the massive German advance, The Russians managed to redeploy most of the divisions stationed in the eastern part of the Soviet Union, those facing Mongolia and Japan, upon discovering that the Japanese had no intention of attacking. These were not just inexperienced troops, but well-equipped field divisions, many trained for winter warfare from the icy lands of Siberia. This strategic movement was crucial for Soviet defense. The divisions transferred from the east bolstered the forces already deployed on the Western Front and strengthened resistance capabilities against the Nazi offensive. The ability of these divisions to operate effectively in a cold and hostile environment proved pivotal in halting the Wehrmacht's advance and altering the course of the war. As Operation Barbarossa drew to a close, Nazi forces and their allies faced a challenging reality on the Eastern Front. Despite initial advances, including the capture of Kiev and the siege of Leningrad, they encountered fierce resistance from the Red Army, which nearly succeeded in completely thwarting their advances as they dangerously approached Moscow. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it, loomed on the horizon as an even more intense and challenging phase of the conflict in the East. After 1945, the Wehrmacht elite systematically embarked on constructing a narrative portraying the German army as blameless, shifting responsibility for crimes committed in Eastern Europe onto the SS. The idea spread that the Nazis were responsible for the atrocities, while the army conducted the conflict in accordance with international law. This narrative of innocence was embraced eagerly by those serving in its ranks. Even the ordinary soldier asserted, "I fought for a clean army, not for a criminal group." Thus, a collective absolution took place, a relief of conscience that endured for decades. It took a long time before historical inquiry in Germany could begin to dismantle that narrative. It was not until 1995 that a significant debate on the subject erupted in Nazi society, driven by the exhibition Crimes of the Nazi Army, War of Annihilation between 1941 and 1944. The exhibition presented documentary evidence, witness testimonies, and shocking photographs revealing the true nature of the war in the East and the central role of the German army in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It also highlighted the complicity and collaboration of many German military units in the atrocities committed by Nazi occupation forces in conquered territories. In conclusion, few historical events contain such an evident contradiction as this. It represented Nazi Germany's greatest momentary triumph, yet simultaneously marked the beginning of its decline. The day Adolf Hitler celebrated what he considered his greatest victory also became the turning point that sealed the catastrophic fate of his regime. The continuation of the Eastern Campaign ultimately trapped and irreversibly weakened the Third Reich. Thus concludes the incredible and paradoxical story of Operation Barbarossa. We invite you to share this video so that more people can discover firsthand the events that signaled the end of Nazi ambitions in Russia and their consequences for World War II. Thank you for joining us in this new installment of military history.